us begin. There you go. Hopefully that's all right. All right, so this week is the making the sign of the cross. I just, based on the syllabus, I want to give a quick update. So I mentioned this before, but so originally this was set to go alternating with the other inquirers class, and it's only once a year, which probably isn't enough. So I need to rethink a little bit of how that's set up, but we'll do the session on Lent at some point, but it isn't as pressing as it was when it's done 6 months prior. I try and make sure that's done before we get into Lent, but of course that's not a concern this time around, so probably that'll be more towards the end. So this week, making the sign of the cross. So I sure hope that you have noticed that we do this thing a lot. All the time, when entering the church, when venerating icons, when we say certain phrases in our services, and all different points through prayers that you may or may not be doing at home as well. This is quite a bit. If you're familiar with some groups, some Christian groups outside of Orthodoxy, there are forms of this that are done. They're all different in one way or another, though. No one makes the sign of the cross the same way that we do. You've got that little diagram there on the front that shows you the basic form. I hope you've picked that up just by osmosis, but if somehow you haven't, there it is. And I do note that you will mostly see that people will do some kind of slight bow afterwards. Sometimes there's a deep bow. We'll talk about some of that later, or even a prostration. But and of course, like I said, if you're coming from Western Christianity, then of course it's the opposite direction. The reason for that is we did it different ways. All right, so the history here. As far back as the 2nd century, there are writers that describe Christians making the sign of the cross on themselves. There's several different forms that are described, but the most common is just a single finger on the forehead. I think there are some groups that maintain this in some form or another to this day, but it's not very common. More of a revival. I shouldn't say maintain. My understanding is there are some revivalist movements that kind of do this. Great, sure. But as with many things in the church, it didn't necessarily stay stagnant and did evolve and grow a little bit. I do want to make it very clear as I go through these dates, these are wildly vague. I'm kind of picking the point that as far as I can tell from the bit of research I did here, is when most of the church had transitioned over to these, but given the lack of the internet, I'm quite positive that there were little pockets here and there that held out much longer. One of the biggest examples of that, which we'll get to, is Russia itself, actually. But we'll talk about that in just a second here. So by about the 4th century, there was a second finger for the two natures of Christ, rather than just the one. This was, I've seen it written that this was specifically supposed to be combating monophysitism, which we've talked about previously, I believe. I'm mixing up my classes in my head now, but I'm fairly certain we've talked about that. Yeah, that was just last week, right, that we talked about? No, heresies. That was the other class. That's 101. All right, you've already had it. So you've had it in the 101. You should know all about the heresies now. If not, go look at your handouts. By about the 9th century, a third finger became the most common, representing the Trinity, and then the lower two were kept as the two natures of Christ. So Trinity and two natures of Christ. However, this was not the case in the Slavic lands. The Slavic lands did not shift over to 3 fingers for quite a while. They maintained the two fingers, usually with the lower 3 kind of kind of in a similar style to what we do, just inverted. You can find paintings. So this was upheld up until the Niconian reforms, there in about the 1600s. They were wildly controversial, rejected by large swaths of the people, and caused a pretty large division in the church in Russia at the time. The remainder of this group today is the Old Believers, and they continue doing this. The Russian church has unanathematized them, so you can find canonical Orthodox churches that continue to cross themselves this way, as those particular communities have always done. So I guess in a sense you can say that if you want to be very pedantic and technical, both forms are used today, but the vast majority of places in the world use the 3 on top and the 2 down. It became almost a sign of the Old Believers, the 2 fingers. So there's several like Renaissance type of paintings you can find of the Old Believers being persecuted, and someone like holding up the 2-fingered cross as their resistance.
I think I've seen a painting like that.
Probably, yeah. Yeah, there's a few of them that I'm aware of. But like I said, other than those communities, to my knowledge, the rest of the Orthodox world uses the 3 and the 2. So I think maybe the next obvious question is when, and the reality is pretty much whenever you want. No one's going to look at you funny or ask what you're doing if you cross yourself at pretty much any time, with maybe one very minor exception. Does anyone, well, we talk about it in a little bit, so I won't spoil that just yet. But generally speaking, there are a few times that are very standard, as I'm sure you've noticed through the liturgies, when pretty much everyone makes the sign of the cross. Of course, when we say glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, now and ever and unto ages of ages, amen. That's, I think, the most iconic form. We say that in a bunch of our prayers, we sing it. Sometimes it's kind of integrated into hymns in maybe a slightly less clear but still the basic form. So sometimes you'll see people cross themselves in the middle of some other hymn that happens to say something about to the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, blah, 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 right? Almost any time, so by extension, almost any time the Trinity is mentioned in 3 parts like that. The next is Holy God, Holy Mighty, which is the Trisagion prayers. So if you are doing some form of morning or evening prayers, that's probably what you start with. Liturgically, we do them multiple different points. If you look back at your handouts from 101, I know for a fact that in some of the description of the services I go through and I mark where those Trisagion prayers are done. So if you have those still and are curious, you can go look. But they're pretty regular. In liturgy, of course, we sing it right before the epistle. So you'll see people doing that then. And then the triple Alleluia that is done at the end of Psalms, primarily. There's a few other times as well, but primarily done at the end of Psalms. Alleluia, 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 glory to thee, our God, and we do that 3 times. So those are the things to kind of be listening for, are those 3. Some mention of the Trinity, Holy God, or the triple Alleluia. There are other kind of standard points like entering and leaving a church. You'll see people make 3 signs of the cross, most specifically when entering the nave, not the narthex, although different people do different things. Especially in our setup where the narthex is way the heck over there. It makes maybe a little more sense to do it when you enter the nave, but like I said, different people do it slightly different ways. So that mic was pointed the other way before, I'm pretty certain. Hopefully I'm not deafening people by handling the mic. Anyway, all right. You'll also see people when venerating the icons, right? There are several different forms here, so I just want to mention real quick because you'll see something and I don't want anyone to be confused. The most common form, to my knowledge, is twice, and then to kiss the icon, or the gospel, or the cross, or whatever it may be that's set out, and then 1 time afterwards. There are some people, I don't really know where this comes from, but you will see those that will do all 3 and then venerate. and a much smaller minority that will just do one and venerate. But the kind of standard form and what you should learn to do if you aren't already is 2 kiss 1. We do that for a lot of things. Like I said, icons, relics, gospel, cross, whatever it may be that we're venerating, that's kind of the standard form. Actually, one more thing that I didn't mention here, which I should have at the top. There's a minor difference between the way that the Slavic churches and the way that the Byzantine churches do the sign of the cross in regards to the bow. You may have noticed, if you've been paying very close attention to Father George, that he does his deep bows kind of opposite. He will bow first and then cross, whereas the Slavic way is to cross first and then bow. It's the same thing. It doesn't really matter. But that is technically a difference. You may at some point in time notice that some people do it inverted. It's the same thing, right? It's just a different order, but it doesn't make any difference. So, just in case you ever notice that. You'll also see, although I don't know how common it is here because my back is turned to you all for most of the time, but crossing the middle point of the church, you'll see whenever I cross the middle point, specifically because of the high place at the front, making the sign of the cross. Am I forgetting anything? Oh, and then whenever we do a prostration, right? Whenever we fall down in worship, that starts with a sign of the cross. We just replace the bow with a going all the way down to the ground. And then the last thing I have in here is whenever you're blessing food, right? Use the same sign. So the priest makes literally signing with the sign of Christ, ICXC. Your fingers, not a gang sign, I promise. Signs with the name of Christ, but for everyone else, you just use the 3 and the 2. And instead of making the sign of the cross on yourself, you make the sign of the cross on whatever the thing is that you're blessing, food or drink or whatever. Although I'll remind you that you are making the sign of the cross as if someone is doing it on top of you, which means it would be inverted on the thing that you are putting it on. Does that make sense? So for yourself, it is right and then left, but over another thing, it would be left and then right. Make sense? Because from the perspective of the person doing it to you, which I know is also you, it is left and then right? Yeah, it's a little confusing, but you'll get it, I promise. As I put here, whenever you want, right? You'll see people, especially some ethnic people that will receive bad news and go, oh, Lord of mercy, right? Or vice versa, they'll get good news and they'll go, oh, glory to God, and make the sign of the cross, right? Fine, great. Do you have to do that? No, you don't have to do that. I don't think it's as common here in the OCA, especially not this church, which is mostly converts, and we do have some ethnic people, obviously, but most of the time they're naturalized a little more, if you will. So, but you may run into that. It's fine. It's not really a big deal. It's pretty much always acceptable. Like I said, with rare exception, which we'll talk about in like 20 seconds, if you feel the need to make the sign of the cross because of pretty much any reason, go for it. You will not be called out. No one will think you're weird or doing the wrong thing or confused or whatever, unless you're outside of an Orthodox context, and then they might be a little confused, but so be it. All right, any questions so far? Okay. So, when not to, there's not very many times. When you are receiving a blessing, most iconically from a bishop, do not make the sign of the cross. I know it might feel a little weird, but someone is making the sign of the cross on you. You don't then do it on yourself, right? So you'll notice that the reason I call out bishops specifically is because it's maybe a little more, it's easier to remember that because if you are observant, you will see that when a priest would normally come out and give a blessing and say, peace be unto all, if a bishop is present, he does not sign. The priest will turn around to everyone and say, peace be unto you all, but will not make the sign. And the bishop will, wherever he is. So if he's behind the altar somewhere, you probably can't see him. If he's sitting off to the side or sitting out in the middle of the church or whatever, you'll see he'll make the sign of the cross at that point in time. But the celebrant will not, because the bishop is present. So the takeaway there is, if you are receiving a blessing, don't bless yourself, don't cross yourself. Similarly, this is a common practice that you will see in some groups. I am asking you not to do this, but you will see people that do it. When you approach the chalice, we are very careful. We have two people standing on either side. They're actually not really there to hold the cloth, right? That is, practically speaking, what they do most of the time. But if you read through some of the prescriptions for having people there, it calls out that they're there to stand guard, right? That they're there to make sure that nothing happens. That if I or Father George or whoever is standing holding the chalice stumbles, there's someone there to hold them. If someone comes up and tries to do something dumb, there's people right there to intervene, so that the person holding the chalice can just hold the chalice and not worry about other things. Similarly, whenever an infant comes forward, I always ask the parents to hold the arms down so they don't kick the chalice or whatever. You do not need to make the sign of the cross when you approach the chalice. Please withhold from doing so. You will see people that do it. I am asking you, please don't. There's just no need to introduce more movement and potential for things to go wrong in that moment. You'll be fine, I promise. And conversely, you'll see people that do the same thing immediately after as well. You don't need to do that. You can, if you feel really, convicted for some reason, but it is better to avoid the chance of something happening than to risk it. So, and then the last time is during the 6 Psalms and Matins. I think this is probably the least observed time, meaning most people will just do what they hear, because there's, in the middle of the 6 Psalms, after the first 3, there's a glory, Alleluia, Lord of mercy, glory, and then we continue with the last 3 Psalms. And many people hearing that will just make the sign of the cross. But properly speaking, you should not be moving or talking in any way, which would include making the sign of the cross during that time. It is the one exception to all of the rules I just said for when to make the sign of the cross. In some parishes, they will go so far as to blow out all the lamps and dim the lights so that we dim the lights, but blow out all the lamps and everything, so the only light in the church is the reader's candle and the one that always stays lit on the altar. It takes some manpower to do that, and we often don't have that, so we don't do that here. But and then, like I said, just standing in prayer, the 6 Psalms we read as the Psalms of the Last Judgment. So we stand before the throne of God, not moving. Those are really the only exceptions to when you would make the sign of the cross. Questions there? Okay. So why do we do this? What's the point? I promise it's not just because we want to all do the same thing at the same time and feel good about some communal, cultish kind of act of being together. It's a powerful weapon. I think I've mentioned before, and will continue to mention, right? We say in the baptismal prayers, which some of you at least will hear, all adverse powers are crushed beneath the sign of the image of the cross. It's part of the, like I said, the exorcism prayers there over the waters. Oh yeah, that's what I have here. So it's purifying, it's sanctifying, right? It's not. It is, of course, a visible symbol of our faith, right? And that in and of itself can be a good reminder for us. But practically speaking, it in and of itself is powerful. That's also why we wear pectoral crosses, the little ones, not just the big one that I do, but the little ones around our necks that you're given at baptism, right? Because they're powerful, because they serve a purpose as a tool, not as a piece of jewelry, just like this isn't just a fun sign to do, right? Obviously, we talked about, right, it's to dive a little bit, the statement of faith, you've got the Trinity and the natures of Christ, right? There's also this whole thing you can find about, Christ descended, coming from heaven, descended to earth, and somehow this right to left is his power to drive away evil or something. you can find people that talk about that, the specific action of the signing of the cross.
But I've read that the direction we do it has something to do with the filth that's not observing that they will
No.
No?
No, when the two churches were in communion, they did different things, right? So, yeah, that of all the things that would need to be reconciled if the two were to come back together, that is one that would not need to be reconciled. They would be perfectly allowed to continue signing themselves the other way. It is just an inverse. So I just said, right, we do it from the perspective of someone else standing in front of you making the sign of the cross over you, even though you're the one doing it, right? They make the opposite claim. I'm the one doing it on me, so I'm going to do it the way that it would be as if I'm blessing anything else, right? If I'm blessing food, I would go from left to right over whatever the thing is. So when I bless myself, I make left to right, whereas we see it as my hand facing this way, so it goes the opposite direction. But it's two sides of the same coin in almost about as literal a sense as it can be, except it's not actually a coin. But all right, and then prostration is kind of the last thing. So we do a lot of prostrations, except not in the services that most people go to. So I said here, usually we end with a slight bow or even a deep bow, like for the Trisagion prayers or the triple Alleluias, right? We go bow all the way down to the ground. You'll see people that do that sometimes before icons or relics or whatever, whether it's a mini bow or a deep bow. But there are a few times when we do significantly more, doing the full prostration. If we were able to be doing weekday services more regularly that were not festal, which obviously is most frequently done in a monastic setting, but sometimes parishes are able to do more, you would see that we have actually rather large chunks of the service that we remain prostrated for. The entire Lord's Prayer, big chunks of the anaphora, you're just down on the ground. And then, when we get into the Lenten period, there's even more for the daily services, right? As we're getting into the pre-sanctified services, and we add all those prayers of St. Ephraim and stuff like that. So depending on the time of year, at least, those weekday services can have a lot of prostrations in them. But for festal things, including the resurrection, which is every Sunday, we give you a little bit of a break, and we don't do anywhere near as many, if any, prostrations. Because of the reality of the world we live in and not being able to do weekday services that most people can attend, it means we kind of get the inverse idea and think that most services don't have prostrations, even though the reality is it should be flipped the other way. That said, in some parishes, in this and some other OCA dioceses, you will see that at the appropriate place in the anaphora where during a daily service you would be prostrating, they will even on Sundays do a prostration. The thought being most people probably aren't doing as many prostrations as they should be on the regular, and so this is at least a way to do something. Ultimately, it's the bishop's decision, and he was the one that was allowing this to happen, so fine. He interprets the canons. There is a canon that says that we are not to be prostrating on Sundays, but as I just called out, it's the bishop's job to enforce those however he so chooses. So, but all that to say, most places around the world, I don't think you will see a prostration done on Sundays, that, to my knowledge anyway. But you might here in the U.S. and specifically here in the OC in this diocese, you may run into some parishes that do a full prostration during those the one part of the anaphora.
Did the parish feast, we did the prostrations before the relics? That's just for that acceptance.
During the parish feast, it's not a feast of the Lord and it's a weekday service, so you should be doing all the prostrations during the service. Yep. Yeah, the only time those are relaxed are for the great feasts, the things we're talking about in the other catechumen class. So for all of the rest of the feast, any of the great, saints that we celebrate, no matter what epitaph we put in front of them, no matter how much we try and claim they're great, they're still not God, so we still do prostrations. The reality, though, is that most people don't know when to do them, and so they just don't. But properly speaking, yeah, you should be doing prostrations on. Yeah, because most people don't know to do them, and so it's kind of fallen off the radar and whatever. But, yeah. So, but yes, it is certainly proper to. I think, well, maybe that was not this year, maybe it was last year. I kind of remember some people did do them, because I think at that point in time when I came here, we were doing 2 weekday liturgies a week. That was their practice when I first arrived, and then because of circumstances with our choir director, that became not possible anymore. So when I first came, there was a core group of people that were used to doing those prostrations on the regular, and so I think they knew that, because I told them that this is a weekday service, this is what we do. But now I think we've kind of fallen off that, and some of those people don't remember. So, but yeah, it's not like you're going to get smited for not doing it or anything, but
Well, I noticed, we ran into, she came for our feast day, and I think she goes to one of the local Greek Orthodox churches,
Mhm.
and she does a full prostration, so one of the gifts are being brought out.
yeah, that's not very common. I think we've talked about that a little bit, right? So during the pre-sanctified services, we know, because we did the sanctification the last weekend, that we have the body and blood of Christ on the paten and in the chalice. And so when they come out for the great entrance, we do the full prostration, and it's done in silence, right? Nothing is said. We just bow down before the Lord. During a normal service, remember we've talked about how we don't really have a set point, and one of the things I point to is that during the great entrance, right, we don't do that prostration. Could it be? I suppose, but because we don't really give a set point, but we do not generally do that prostration because we don't know for sure, I guess. But yeah, don't probably feel obligated to do that. All right. There are a few other times. Oh, right. The last thing during weekday services or the pre-sanctified is when the chalice is brought out for communion, and afterwards when the priest turns around and says, "For blessed is our God, always now and ever and unto ages of ages," and then goes back in. Right. Both of those times you do prostrations. I won't tell you the exception, it's not important for right now. In Lent, which we'll talk about later, we skipped that one for now. I mentioned the prayer of St. Ephraim. I think you're all familiar with that because you were here for at least some part of Lent, and generally through the pre-sanctified liturgy, the entirety of the third antiphon in the pre-sanctified liturgy, because there's some prayers done, and then it's transferred from the altar onto the table of oblation, so we do prostration for that time. The Light of Christ for the Let My Prayer Arise in its entirety. And then during the Feasts of the Cross, when we sing Before the Cross, we bow down and worship. We bow down and worship, just like the hymn says. And then there's a few other times, like during the icons of Christ the Bridegroom, or sometimes it's called Extreme Humility, the one that shows him with his arms crossed, and the crown of thorns with the cross behind him, but him not on it yet. And then, like I said, when the cross is out, or sometimes people will do relics if it's like the parish feast or one they're particularly connected to. The other time, another time is, were you all here in one form? No, maybe not, for the Forgiveness Vespers last year. or this year. Sorry. No, not no for you two. Okay, so well, I'll warn you now. It's a lot of prostrations. We do what is called the rite of forgiveness, which is where we do prostration before every member of the parish. We make a big old conga line around the church, and we make prostrations in front of everyone and ask forgiveness as we begin our Lenten journey. As I jokingly told the people last year as we began, may your legs burn so your soul doesn't. Yes, yeah. Yes, which just as you're starting to finally feel like maybe you're turning a corner a little bit, then we smack you with all these canons of St. Andrew where you just do even more prostrations. Yeah, it's great. So, yeah. And you'll read stories sometimes of saints that having done something or feeling so compelled will, outside of that particular liturgical rite of forgiveness, will ask forgiveness of someone else with a similar prostration. Generally speaking, we do not use prostrations as forms of fealty, as you see sometimes in the West. Yeah, it's almost always, well, it's always associated with forgiveness for us.
Yeah, like Russian literature, like Dostoevsky books is a really big one in that, like, when somebody does something and, like, they fall down and, like, they kiss their feet and stuff, and, like, they'll be like, forgive me.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I mean, and there's many other examples of that amongst the lives of saints and whatnot. So, yeah, pretty common form. Probably most people, though, only ever actually see that done on the rite of forgiveness at the beginning of Lent. But technically speaking, if you do seriously wrong someone some other time, you could do that. I think most people today would probably think it was a little overkill, but yeah, we do it once a year. Yeah. We've already called this out, but just not Sunday's Paschal Tide. I think maybe we didn't explicitly say it, but for the entirety of Paschal Tide and the Great Feast of the Lord. So they're the only times we don't.
I'm guessing the deacon, with all these things, all those scenarios, would definitely help us. When he would prostrate,
Yep.
you'd be like, okay, that's definitely a time to prostrate.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Nearly all, well, yeah, some of the anaphora, the deacon would be assisting in the altar, but for the Lord's Prayer, he'd be out and prostrating and some of the other times. So, yeah, definitely.
I think the only time we do kneeling is at kneeling vesper.
Yeah, we really don't do kneeling. That's a good point. Yeah, I don't really talk about that in this, but kneeling is not our position of prayer. And for the vast majority of the time, we do not kneel for basically anything. It's such an uncommon thing that the few times we do kneel, we named the entire service Kneeling Vespers. So, yeah, we've got some little pads we bring out, but
Which is also very different in the West. Like when I was in Rome, like everywhere they went is a kneel.
Yeah.
And then they do it, like the iconic symbol, like a nun kneeling, praying.
So I think the only time that you'll really see kneeling in our Orthodox Church is when they have pews, and therefore you can't really do prostrations because you're going to smack your head against the piece of wood in front of you. So, so they kneel instead. I will leave it to others to comment on whether or not that's a good thing, but the tradition of the church is pretty firmly in the camp of not kneeling, with the exception of the kneeling Vesper service.
So that practice of at least prostration has slowly gone away, and then at least with the Greeks and more like the U.S. because of the pews, because you can't really prostrate with your pews in the way.
Yeah. Yeah.
It just more just turns into deep bows to prostrating.
Mm-hmm.
Shame.
Yeah, I mean, I was in an Antiochian church, and we did, prostrations for the rite of forgiveness and during Lent and stuff like that for the pre-sanctified services. So, I mean, yeah, it just depends on the community and if they have pews and if they remember that prostrations are a thing. But, yeah.
Well, they definitely seem to cross themselves a lot more. The Greeks do than and kind of they do it more than the Russian one, but yeah, they definitely seem like to cross a lot more.
You're talking extemporaneously or liturgically?
Like the church, like for all it seems like it's more like common to do it during the Lord of Mercies. Like they do it pretty common during that one. I see at least like the Greek ones do it. Like some of the Russians.
If you've got a deacon, they'll be crossing themselves
Yeah.
after every petition, and you should be following whatever the deacon does, so.
Yeah.
You would be crossing yourself every time.
Or when I went to St. Innocent's a couple of times, nobody really crosses themselves when they say Lord of mercy, but like when she was saying, the one that was there from the Greek Orthodox Church, yeah, she was there, and even some of the other ones that came to our feast day from the Greek Church. Yeah, they cross, and then even some of them even more deeper bows a lot too.
Yeah.
But you see, like from the couple that was here, was not really everybody
So-
doing it.
The people that came here from the Greek church came from the church in Castro Valley, which I believe is where the protodeacon is. For he's associated with the bishop and kind of follows him around a little bit. So they're probably a little more in tune with some of that because they have a deacon serving there regularly, and they see him saying a petition and then crossing himself. And at some point, you see that enough times, and you go, "Huh, maybe I should do the same thing."
Yeah, pick that up pretty quick.
Yeah.
Oh, we should do that.
If you see Father doing a prostration, you do a prostration.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One
Yeah,
of
there
During Lent.
there are a handful of times where I have to cross myself that, I mean, you certainly can because it's never really wrong, but it wouldn't be expressly called for that everyone else. But there is no time that is called for me to prostrate that you wouldn't also be prostrating. So if you see me prostrating, get
I'll
down.
do it.
Yeah.
Except for Sunday?
Well, you won't see me do it, so don't do it.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah, no, me and Nick are very bulking up, sorry. We already knew about it.
Keep going on those squats.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're hiking up Mission Peak backwards every day.
Yeah, he, like, would come and you better stretch. I'm like, I'm fine. How
Yeah.
was your thing?
Canada and St. Andrew was a lot, yeah. That was, it was nice though, but yeah, my legs were actually sore after.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Now just to imagine having done the rite of forgiveness a day or two before. Yeah,
Oh, that was painful.
yeah.
But like you said, though, during the day, more commonly, if this was like a more Orthodox community and the church was doing daily liturgies, or at least liturgy throughout the day, like you said, like that would be pretty common. You would walk in, let's say, like this is all our first time, and you would see everybody prostrating a lot throughout the service.
Yeah, during the second half, right? The first half is taken more from the synagogue practice, and it's mostly leading up to the reading of scripture. But the second half being sort of the consecration and distribution of the gifts, the Eucharist. Yeah, you'd see several times through that where we do prostrations.
And it's definitely like a different lens too, because it's like nobody really does that in the West, at least in like the Western Rite and the Catholic world, especially the Protestant ones. So like, I know like for a lot of people when they see the prostrations, they're like, that looks a lot like Islam.
Yeah, to my knowledge, in the Western Church, you get, I mean, bowing, kneeling, genuflecting, and whatever they call it, where you just kind of lay flat, prone on the ground, which I think is mostly only done during like ordinations. I don't think that's common
Yeah,
during. You just like plank on the ground.
what I know from previous friends, was a very bad Catholic. A lot of like when nuns are brought
Yeah.
into the orders, they will just,
Yeah.
they'll be out
And-
in lines, just crossed, like
Yep.
completely flat.
I think that's also true for clergy. We don't do those last three at all. We never just lay down on the ground. That's a position of sleep in our style. So genuflecting, I don't really have any particular reason for why we don't do that. I don't really know why they do. And then kneeling, like I said, we do, but only at those few times. So, yeah. I will also add, if you are sick or injured or elderly or whatever it may be, you will definitely see people that, for one reason or another, cannot or maybe should not do prostrations, and then they will just substitute it with a deep bow. That's fine. If you're coming in on, crutches or something, I'm not going to ask you to be doing multiple full prostrations. So, you would do what you can in that case, but yeah. Other questions? How are we doing for time? I don't actually know where we are. 5:45. Oh, okay. Fine. I mean, we can certainly end a little early if there's nothing else. Sometimes people have a lot for this one, but it just depends.
Not too much on this one.
Well, some people really like to get into all the particulars of, what about this, what about that, or I saw someone do this, or I saw someone not do that, or whatever, so.
Yeah, not that much on this one, like, kind of straightforward.
All right. Well, if that's all, then we'll call that good. I believe at this point we'll go back to Friday like normal. This is just because yesterday was Halloween, so. Didn't want to deal with people knocking at our door through the evening. All right. Well, thank you all.